Good morning. My name is Chris Jones. I'm with University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. We are holding our weekly Garden and Country Extension webinar. Today we have Ann George with us. We're going to be talking about creating pollinator habitats and conservation partnerships. Quickly about these webinars. I've been doing them weekly since we kind of got into the COVID pandemic. These webinars, I keep them about 60 minutes or less. We're doing Thursday mornings at 11 in Arizona. We feature a variety of horticultural and natural resource topics relevant to the environmental conditions and residential concerns of Gila County, Arizona. That can be of concern to people living outside of this county, and you're very welcome to participate with us. Recordings are posted at the YouTube channel for Arizona Cooperative Extension. So you can get there from my Garden and Country Extension webinar page, or you can just look up like Arizona Cooperative Extension, YouTube, and you'll be able to find these webinars. And like to be sure that people are aware the University of Arizona is an equal opportunity affirmative action institution. Today, our agenda here, thank you for everybody who came in early and logged in. I'm Chris Jones. I'm doing the welcome. I'm your moderator. Our presenter is Ann George. She'll be talking about creating pollinator habitats and conservation partnerships. Ann will speak for about 30 minutes with a PowerPoint slide and a slideshow. At about 11:35, we'll open it up for a Q&A discussion with Ann. You can put your questions into the Q&A or into the chat box as you wish. And I'll send out an evaluation link. As a matter of fact, it's already in the chat box. So feel free to just open that up and respond to it at the end. And then we'll end the call for lunch. This is Ann George. She is the Senior Scientist for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Freeport-McMoRan Incorporated. And with that, Ann, I'm going to hand it over to you. So go ahead and open up, share the slides. And
thanks, Chris. Let me go ahead and share my presentation. And let's go to the full screen view. Know when you see it in the proper format.
I'll let you know, yeah.
That should be right.
That is it. We are ready.
All right.
Thank you.
Perfect. Well, Chris, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity to present to this group. I am very excited to be here. And for this presentation, I'll be talking to everybody about our 10 years or so of experience, Freeport's experience with creating and enhancing habitat for pollinators through engagement with the community and conservation partners, and how we've leveraged those efforts also for education and outreach. So again, my name is Ann George. I am a scientist with Freeport-McMoRan, an ecologist by training, and I've been with the company for 10 years now. And throughout that time, working on our voluntary biodiversity projects and a number of pollinator projects, which I will talk to you about in a bit more detail. So for anyone who is not familiar with Freeport-McMoRan, I'll give a quick introduction. We are the largest publicly traded copper producer globally, and we are also a significant producer of molybdenum and gold. Our active mining operations are in North and South America, as well as in Indonesia. And we have a significant portfolio of inactive operations also. So you might wonder why a copper mining company is concerned about conservation or concerned about pollinators at all. And to that, I would say that investing in biodiversity and conservation is part of the company's business ethic and certainly a key part of our sustainability programs. And so there are many reasons why we would invest in conservation projects. Excuse me. One of the key reasons is to maintain our social license to operate. And social license is a critical part of our business. It's important to our shareholders. And how we pursue and maintain that social license varies really from place to place, but there are some commonalities, and stakeholder engagement and demonstration of our committed stewardship efforts, transparency, all of those things are key to maintain our social license to operate. And so partnerships is something I'll be touching on quite significantly throughout this presentation. And as a company, we recognize that partnerships in both our conservation and education efforts are key to the success of our projects. All right. So all of these photos, I'll start by saying all of these photos are taken on Freeport properties. Freeport is a large landholder in the communities where we operate. And certainly we operate in a wide variety of ecosystems and habitat types, which host a diversity of wildlife. So all these amazing photos, as I mentioned, are on our properties, as are these. These are some of the pollinators you can find at Freeport sites. Some of the more exotic looking ones, like the butterfly in the top right, that's from our Indonesia site. But many of these pollinators are local. And when we think about pollinators, many people think about honeybees right off the bat. But there are so many more unmanaged pollinators that are critical to us and that provide ecosystem services to people. For instance, butterflies, hummingbirds, native bees, of which there are about 1,000 species right where I am in the Sonoran Desert, and some of the lesser known pollinators like flies and wasps and beetles and ants even. And so because Freeport has such a diversity of pollinators across our sites, we have been presented with a huge opportunity to manage and conserve those pollinators. But let's take a step back and talk a little bit about why pollinators are important to begin with. In fact, I think this is a very nice photograph, a visual to demonstrate the importance of pollinators. As most of you probably know, pollinators are vital to the functioning of agricultural and natural ecosystems. And our managed and wild pollinators combined help pollinate over 75% of our cultivated crops. And we're not just talking about foods that we eat, we're also talking about spices, we're talking about beverages, fibers, medicines, about 1,000 of these in combination depend on animal-assisted pollination. And it's been estimated that it's about a $200 billion economy. Let me go back. I think I missed a few slides. Okay. So this slide is just a small list of some of those crops and the animals that are known to pollinate them. The photo on the bottom right is of a lesser long-nosed bat pollinating an agave, from which we get agave syrup and tequila. So this is just an interesting list for a couple of foods and the pollinators that you might not be aware of, like the wasp is required for fig pollination. Mangoes and avocados are typically pollinated in the tropics by bats. But of course, pollinators are in decline globally, and there are a couple of items I want to touch on in this slide. For honeybees, colony collapse disorder is probably something that most of you are familiar with or have heard of. And it was identified in the early 2000s. And from what I read recently, the percentage of hives that are affected by colony collapse disorder has decreased. And that's certainly good news. But now we're still talking about 30 or so percent, as opposed to 60-some% of managed colonies that are impacted by colony collapse disorder. And our native bees, of course, are not immune either. 25% or thereabouts of native bumblebees are at risk of extinction, and many other species are vulnerable as well. In the past 20 years, monarch butterflies have declined by about 80%, and this is from the Xerces Society. So all those are certainly worrying statistics, and there is a combination of causes, habitat loss, habitat conversion, fragmentation, for everything from commercial development to residential, agricultural development. And using pesticides, widespread pesticide use has also been implicated, as well as introduced disease and pathogens. So with that in mind, I'd like to shift gears onto a more positive note. And let's look at how Freeport has contributed to the pollinator conservation efforts to combat the decline of pollinators. All right. So Freeport's Pollinator Conservation Initiative was launched in 2011. And this corporate initiative was supported by Freeport's environmental and sustainable development leadership teams. And we have been partnering with a number of conservation organizations across the years. Some of these are mentioned on the poster we have, on the banner we have: Gila Watershed Partnership, Wildlife Habitat Council, Borderlands. But at a more local level in Gila County, we've partnered with Chris in the Gila County U of A Extension. We've partnered with Boyce Thompson Arboretum, and a number of other grassroots or local groups in the communities where we operate. And there are three main goals of this initiative. The first one is to increase habitat for pollinators. And this is not just on Freeport property, but it can also be in other green spaces, in schools, within the communities where we are. And also to foster partnerships with conservation efforts. While we have a lot of passion around pollinator conservation, we are not necessarily the experts. And so we want to build these strong relationships with our conservation partners in order to obtain the best information, the best technical recommendations in order to conserve pollinators. And finally, we seek to provide learners of all ages with opportunities to engage in environmental education, whether it's student groups or scouts or retirees or employees, but using pollinators and pollinator habitats as the lens through which we can promote education and outreach. So let's look at some of Freeport's pollinator habitats. So right now we have about 15 conservation projects across our communities in North America. And as I mentioned, these are not always on company property. The photo on the right is developing pollinator garden in the Sarita Middle School near Greenberry. And while each habitat looks very different, there's certainly no one size fits all for our pollinator projects. There are some common characteristics for each of them. So let's drill down and see what exactly makes a successful pollinator habitat. And we will use Freeport's Miami Pollinator Garden as our case study. So this is a nice photo of the Miami Pollinator Garden in full bloom. And I'll give you a little bit of background on this garden actually before we proceed. Miami has been managing pollinators since about 2012. This garden is 1.5 acres or thereabouts. And it was designed by students at the Taliesin School of Architecture. And there are a number of features that make this garden really interesting. There is a walking path, there are educational nodes, there are water retention basins, these basin and swale features to collect rainwater. And all of these aspects were very deliberately built into the garden to provide maximum value and certainly educational opportunities. And so before, this 1.5 acres was essentially an abandoned lot. It had a number of asphalt pads and invasive species, all of which were removed to create this garden. All right. let's talk a little bit. These photos, of course, are still from the Miami garden. Let's talk a little bit about what are the key aspects, of a pollinator habitat. And there are a few things you definitely want to have in your habitat. You need food sources, both for your larval species like caterpillars and thereabouts, and also butterflies and bees. So if your pollinator habitat provides a variety of these host plants throughout each season, that will provide maximum value for your pollinators throughout the year. The photo that you're looking at in the bottom left, butterfly puddle. And so it doesn't look like a whole lot, but it actually provides a valuable water source. And students and interns, I believe, work together to install this water puddle. And what's going to happen is it'll be filled. There is a bentonite clay. It's lined with clay and it'll be filled with water, not so deep that bees and such would drown, but just enough to keep the surface layer moist. And of course, our pollinators also need shelter and breeding sites. And you can see that Miami has a nice bee block that students are examining on the top left. And they've also got a couple of extras. And this, you can get a better sense of what the garden looks like. There is a nice walking path. There are benches to sit on and relax. There is educational infrastructure, with the signage. And in fact, in that same photo, you can see another native bee block in the background. And structural heterogeneity is also important in a garden. If you have trees or shrubs, that provides some additional shelter for your pollinators. So that brings us to our last section of this presentation. And I want to take a deeper dive into what Freeport, as a company, what we have learned in the past 10 years of conserving pollinators. So this is not from the Miami garden. This is also taken by one of Freeport's employees near the Morenci area. But it's a beautiful spring, a wildflower bloom in the spring. And one of the things we've learned is that, when you sow your wildflower seeds in your garden or in your backyard, this is really what you're hoping for, of course. But you may, more often than not, end up with something like this. This is from our rain garden in the Paul Huber Middle School in Douglas. This is the early stages of Miami's pollinator garden. And the Celebratel Middle School garden that we looked at earlier. And so all of these are more likely what you're going to get when you're starting out and building a pollinator garden from scratch. And one of the things we recommend is to start small. There's absolutely nothing wrong in starting small. In fact, it is recommended so you can expand as you go out and build on your successes. And also manage your expectations. I mean, everyone wants a spectacular wildflower bloom right, off the bat, but you need to realize that certainly in the desert, especially, that plants take a lot of time to grow and establish and develop, which in fact leads me to another lesson we've learned, which is to have a plan for maintaining that pollinator garden. Planting a diversity of species is not necessarily enough. You need to have a long-term management or maintenance plan to make sure that your plants survive and they thrive. And of course, if at all possible, use the pollinator habitat for education and outreach. And sometimes kids don't have pollinator gardens at their school and they don't have opportunities to come to Freeport sites to learn about pollinators for a variety of reasons. Access is limited. And so in those cases, we have found that it's really effective to bring the pollinators to them. And that's what you're looking at here. Several examples across the portfolio. On the left-hand side, we are celebrating Earth Day at Eastern Arizona College, and they are looking at a live pollinator exhibit. And the students at the San Carlos Reservation on the bottom right also are looking at some monarch or queen caterpillars at the booth. In the top right-hand photo, that is taken at our PT Freeport Indonesia site, and they have a dedicated butterfly sanctuary where students can come and see a number of species of butterflies and caterpillars that are being reared in the sanctuary before they are released. And of course, lean into your conservation experts. As I mentioned earlier, we are learning, certainly learning a lot from our partners, but our conservation experts are the folks who have the technical know-how. And so, definitely consult them as much as possible and keep a close relationship with your partners to bolster the success of your projects. And of course, engage volunteers, scouts, retirees, employees, definitely get a lot of people involved in all these projects if at all possible. And finally, I would say one of the most important lessons that we have learned is to celebrate our successes, celebrate our milestones, because it's so important for everyone to feel a mutual sense of ownership and a mutual sense of pride in the project. And so celebrations are a great way to cap off a successful pollinator project. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time and attention. And Chris and I will be happy to take questions and get some discussion going.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so this is the time we'll open it up. People feel free to enter a question into the chat box or into the Q&A, and I'll help relay those to Anne. Some of the things that I was thinking about as we were going forward, really appreciate a focus on taking care of the pollinators and their habitat. When we help them, we help a great deal more of the habit of the ecology and everything involved there. And something that I've noticed in recent years is some changes in like phenology, when things are blooming, and what types of impacts have you been seeing on I don't know what exactly you're looking at, but if you're looking at some of the insect populations or pollinator populations, you mentioned some of the statistics earlier, but what have you seen locally?
So actually this is going to be, I suppose my answer will be a specific subset of answering your question, but we have been working with the National Phenology Network through our bats and agaves partnership, and that is a whole separate program. But essentially, one of the outcomes is that we've noticed that the agaves and saguaro have shifted in the times where they bloom, and so now there is a disconnect between when the bats migrate, when those nectivorous bats migrate, and when the blooms essentially are available to them. And so that was one of the factors that kicked off this Bats and Agaves initiative, trying to plant, thousands of agaves across the landscape in southwestern Arizona and certainly New Mexico. And that's another initiative that is being led by our local conservation partners.
Yeah. So one thing, I think Robin was complimenting me on the background shot. I don't know if you took this picture, but this is the pollinator garden in Miami when we had nice rains and everything up, and just beautiful when that happens. Few questions that are coming in. I have a question from Susan in Payson that's interested in pollinator plants for the Payson area, a little higher elevation. Have you got any ideas or general ideas for that?
Yes. So Susan, if you go to the Pollinator Partnerships website, they have these eco-regional planting guides. And what you do is you put in your zip code and it'll pull up a document that has suggestions on pollinator plantings for your specific local area. So that I found is a very valuable resource that I definitely recommend you check out.
And say that one more time and I'll put it into the chat box. Pollinator
Partnership, they have an eco-regional planting guide.
Pollinator Partnership ecological or regional ecology.
Eco-regional planting guide.
Okay, so I just put that into the chat box for people. People are asking some specific things, you know. Linda wants to know where she can get some instructions on how she can put together a garden, pollinator habitat. Are there instructions for building a bee house?
So the instructions on building a bee house, yes, we have actually got there. We've seen quite a few online. I cannot think of anything off the top of my head. That might be a Google exercise. But you know, one of the things about building a bee block, essentially you need an untreated piece of wood, and you drill holes of different sizes because the different diameter holes attract different species. And you just want to make sure that wood is not treated, and you drill it not through the back, but you just drill it, you know, into your piece of wood, not all the way through, and you leave it out essentially in a shady spot. And it's one of those things where if you build it, they will come. You know, so that's of course a very general answer, but there are more specific directions from multiple sources online if you want to take a look.
Very good, and I would hope that the Pollinator Partnership would also have some ideas or resources for that.
So does the Xerces Society. In fact, before I forget, the Xerces Society has a lot of technical documents on their website on insect pollinators specifically. So bee blocks and how to make a bee block is something that they would have.
Good. So we have a question. I think it was Connor here. Have you done any revegetation projects without irrigation in Arizona? And if so, what techniques are successful and what have you learned?
Oh, yes, that is an excellent question. So by and large, when we do our reclamation activities, we do not use any supplemental watering. And so you need to utilize a number of alternative techniques. There are a couple of things you can do. There used to be a product called dry water, if you're familiar with that at all. I think it might be discontinued, but yeah, it's like a hydrogel. And you dig a hole and bore a hole in the ground, and you put that hydrogel in the soil, and it slowly releases water. So that's one option. Another one is creating these little resource islands. So in very arid areas, you know, where you have no supplemental water, what you're doing essentially is gathering biomass, whether it's twigs or piles of grass or logs or whatever it is, and it acts like a catchment, if you will, and a catchment for nutrients, a catchment for water, and those resource islands can promote growth, you know, with very little rain. Technique has been used in arid areas in the deserts of Africa, if I'm not mistaken. I can't recall where specifically, but certainly been used successfully.
I've been hearing recently about this concept of the resource island. And I was talking with some people about biochar, and they were thinking about how they might be able to incorporate that into a small space, create the swells and beams and berms, you know, to be able to hold moisture in one spot, and the cover like you just described, along with some biochar for the soil, and see what that can do. So great, very good. I want to have a comment here from Lorraine Etchell. Lorraine was part of the Taliesin students that designed the place at the garden in Miami. And she just says it's looking good, and really appreciate that opportunity to be part of it. Erin Posthumus, you probably know Erin. She says, when selecting species to plant for pollinators, are you considering planting species that will be adapted for future climate conditions, e.g. warmer temperatures, or primarily species that are adapted for current conditions?
That's an interesting question. I would say we select native species of local ecotypes, you know, to ensure that they are more likely to survive where you plant them, but they are certainly adapted to current climate conditions. I wouldn't say we have typically looked at plants that, you know, for future conditions. No.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well,
Is that something that you are familiar with at all, Chris?
And what we know about a lot of these native plants, you know, they could have wide ranges of tolerance for temperatures and changes. For example, the Fremont cottonwood. You'll find cottonwoods, if they have enough water, growing around 2,000 feet up to about 6,000 feet. So, you know, it just depends on certain species and how wide their temperature tolerances are. Our friend and colleague, Jordan Mann, has put in that he's available to answer Miami pollinator garden specific questions. So I'm going to allow Jordan to talk. I'm going to add him to the list here because I think he's got something to share. Excellent resource. I got to work with Jordan to put this in, and we really appreciate the opportunity to get to know him. A few other questions. So C. Cooper's asking, a few years back, he recalled a concern with cell phone frequencies impacting bee populations. Has that been proven or sustained as a real concern?
I don't believe that is something I can speak to. I might be leaning to you, Chris, to shed some light on that.
I am certainly not aware that cell phone frequencies have any impact on the bee population. They've had a lot of other impacts with mites and moving around and, you know, being used commercially and back in trucks that have really impacted their bee populations. But as far as cell phone frequencies, I don't believe that's a real issue. There you go. Okay, so another comment, a mycologist. Okay, so he reads, a mycologist mentions mushrooms in his work to help fight against a virus contributed colony collapse in bees. Do you know more about this or the use of mushrooms for your habitats?
No, I don't, but I certainly want to learn more about it. I mean, that sounds fascinating.
So he mentions a Paul Stamets, Stamets, as the mycologist. So no, I'm not aware of that at all. The bee colony collapse, big concern for all of us. Most of us don't have a whole lot of knowledge about it, but perhaps I could get a speaker on in the future. Interesting. Michael Burgoyne asks, where do you get information for ecological history of the Sonoran Desert and surrounding Southwest area? So native plants, biome regions, ecological history, Sonoran Desert.
And Jordan, please jump in as well, because certainly you would have had to look some of that up in the creation of Miami's garden. So, you know, I don't want to.
Yeah, so, you know, the USDA actually puts out a lot of really good information on native species. There are, you know, certain companies and organizations that have native plant and native wildflower seed mixes specifically to the Sonoran Desert. You know, and this kind of ties in with a question that Connor had earlier about without irrigation, you know, doing revegetation without irrigation. So all of the seed mixes, you know, specifically the one that you see in Chris's background is a Sonoran Desert wildflower mix. Those plants, specifically the seed mixes, grew with only precipitation. So we don't supply irrigation at the Miami garden to the seed mix. All those, you know, very prolific wildflowers grew because they're adapted to the region, they're native plants. And, you know, that is confirmed. You know, you can confirm those seed mix if they're native with the USDA. They have a very thorough database of native plants. And, you know, you're able to just, it'll be one of the first options if you Google a plant and whether it's native, right? So they put out a lot of really good info on there.
Thank you, Jordan. I also think that, Michael, you could talk with Prescott College or any of our state universities, look for the appropriate ecology department And I think you should be able to find some good resources in history there that they've done some research on and published and so on. So I think it's pretty available, just need to do a little digging. Another question here for us, Anne. Tommy Swimmer asked, what are some indicators of a successful pollinator habitat that can be quantitatively measured? Really specific here. These people are into it.
Yes. All right. So I would say that as part of your monitoring efforts, and that's something, in fact, I didn't touch on too much, but monitoring is a key part of tracking the success of our pollinator projects. And so there are a couple of things you can monitor. You can monitor the plants themselves. You can monitor phenology, when they're flowering, but you certainly can monitor the use of your garden and pollinator plants by those pollinators. And, depending on who's doing the monitoring and the level of expertise, you may not be able to identify bees on the fly, certainly, but, essentially taxonomic groups and numbers and diversity is something that you can keep track of across time.
Good. Leanne Berry asked, have you had to do anything to the soils in these areas to boost nutrients, any composting?
Jordan, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So we have not. All the soil, we did some grading at first to kind of clear some area, but we have not done any fertilizers, anything like that, other than some mulching around some of the trees that were planted. We've had a few growing seasons now in the garden. So typically what we'll do is at the end of the growing season, after the plants have, sort of died back, is we'll come through with a trimmer and kind of trim all of the died back, all the trimmings, and leave those in the garden as sort of a natural soil builder, right? They'll decompose. They'll decompose by the end of the winter with the rainy season and add back a lot of the nutrients into the soil. And, we just keep getting more flowers each year because of that.
Hopefully it's kind of just a positive feedback. The more you get, right? So.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not too sure we're going the right direction with this question. Kathleen Corman says, I'm familiar with Stamets bee work. You're saying that water isn't needed to get them started even. I'm not sure. We're talking about the mushrooms. Yeah, I don't know if we can talk to that, Kathleen. Anne, you agree with that?
Yep.
Okay, move along here. All right. And she said that was just a different comment. Okay. All right, let's head over here to the Q&A questions. The attendee says, we have had 3.84 inches of rain so far this year. That sounds like here in Globe, Miami. We have not seen very few seeds that will sprout under these conditions. Yeah, what do you recommend? This has just been a really rough year.
Yes. What do you recommend? Hope for a better 2021 on all fronts, but it depends on where you are. If you have the option of yes, so I was going to say, if you have the option of watering those seeds, you may have greater success. But in truth, you do rely on the vagaries of the weather so often when you are hoping that wildflower seeds will sprout. I mean, we've sown seeds and watered them, but they perhaps germinate and just don't take, or, they need specific humidity conditions, specific watering frequencies. And so
we can't do much about drought. And we've been basically in a drought since the beginning of this century here in Arizona. It's been having a lot of impacts, a lot of changes, as we were just describing, even the phenology and the timing of things blooming. one thing I would think is get aware of non-native invasive plants. We've having problems with these red brome, others. If you're able to pull those plants, because they can really take advantage of these weather conditions and get established, so that when we do get the rain, you're able to get the native plants back in there. We have a lot of perennial native plants as well that, if you can get those in, contour barrier work, help to be able to hold the soil in place so that when we do get the rains, the native plants are able to take advantage of it. Those are just some thoughts I would have. Okay. But what Freeport-McMoRan manages a lot of property. You work with reclaimed water for a lot of your projects. Have you used that for any of to try to irrigate for some of these pollinator habitats, or would it be advisable? What are you doing with kind of supplemental water to help with some of these, say, resource islands?
Jordan, do you want to speak to that for the Miami Garden?
I can speak to that a little bit. So part of the built environment in the garden is these rainwater catchment swales, and we try to make the best use of the water that we have in the garden that comes naturally. So when rain falls, the garden's naturally designed to hold that water and use that water in the garden. This garden specifically is not connected to any reclaimed water systems, but we have other areas on site where we do reuse and recycle water.
Okay. Okay, so Michael kind of got kicked off when he asked that question about where to get information. Here he's asking again. I heard at the end Jordan saying to Google for native plants. He's just curious if there are any unanimous standardized place people can go to look up for the history of an environment, such as forest cover or desert coverage. Again, I was thinking going back to the state universities where you can gather some of that information. I can't think of just one site to go to for this. Clearinghouse, perhaps NRCS would be a good resource.
I'm trying to think of who puts out, whether it's Game and Fish or another, Fish and Wildlife or another organization that essentially has these eco-regional maps at various scales that you can, dig into, and then from those categories find out more about essentially the local ecology. Do you know who does that, Chris? I don't recall the name of them.
Can't recall at the moment here.
Okay.
So Izzy Brood is asking, can the public visit this site in Miami? I believe it. You just need a talk with Robin Bradford, or Ann, I guess, but Robin, and I think it's by appointment. Is that correct? I can bring Robin's name up here, but Jordan, maybe you could answer.
Jordan?
So Robin Bradford's going to be the contact for anyone who wants to check out the Miami Pollinator Garden.
Right. Yeah. They've really designed it to be able to do that. So give them a call. I think you'll be able to find a time to be able to see it. We're real proud of it. It's nice to be right on Highway 60.
Yeah.
People can see it.
And I'll be honest, it's, now, right now isn't really the time to come see it, but, in March, April, when the plants are really blooming from in the spring, it's pretty neat.
So
everything's pretty gray right now.
Yeah, it just hasn't rained, I know.
Right.
And you mentioned that Freeport-McMoRan is working on at least 15 pollinator projects across North America. Can
Yes.
you mention a few that you're been active with and participated in or aware of?
Mm-hmm. And so we have, in our operating communities is really where we find these projects in Safford, Morenci, Baghdad, Bisbee. Of course, Bisbee is a discontinued operation, but certainly Bisbee also, and in Green Valley with our Sierrita mine. And as I said, some of these projects are on Freeport property, but some of them are offsite. And it's really the offsite properties, the gardens that are in the community, that are in the schools, that provide a lot more value because they're so much more accessible to the public. And certainly there are more options for education outreach with those green spaces in the community.
Well, I think that's a great opportunity to work with some of the local schools and make those connections. Good. Let's see here. We got some more questions. So Michael said he was able to find the EPA website. So we were able to help out with that. Kathleen do you recommend a particular seed mix or a brand of? I think we're going to be going back to that pollinator ecoregion, or is there a certain company or companies you've worked with to get your seeds, or maybe that's useful?
So we work with a large scale seed producer and supplier. They're called Granite Seed. They're based in Utah, if memory serves me. But that is, we're talking about for reclamation projects where it's thousands of acres. For smaller scale efforts, I actually like going to the native arboretums or the, I was going to say desert museum. That's not the word I was looking for. In Tucson, for example, there is a native seed search, and they do have bags of wildflower seeds for different purposes, which I really like a lot. So if you can purchase something locally, that also increases your chances that the seeds in that mix are of a local ecotype, which is what you're looking for, something that's locally adapted that is more likely to survive.
I think it takes a little research. You need to spend some time, talk with people who are locally and some of the ecologists, and our Boyce Thompson Arboretum's a really good location as well to get some information. Spend a little time figuring out what grows well and just try to maximize your success that way. And as soon as I mentioned that, there Jeannie goes, Boyce Thompson Arboretum was a great source for native plants. I live very near the Pollinator Garden, had great success with Angelina daisy, numerous salvias, penstemons, golden poppy, globe mallow, and various agaves and yucca and so on. So that's just kind of local here. Izzy, Robin did put her email in there for what it says to panelists. Let me make sure it gets out to the attendees. So there's Robin's information. Matter of fact, Robin, I was just going to put you on if you don't mind, and you can just share about it if you want to. And if you don't, just say, Chris, I prefer not to.
Sure. Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, we would be happy to, bring some people on site to have a look, and we're always, looking at new ideas for volunteer opportunities and ways to get the community involved in a hands-on way. So yes, just please email me if you would like to come visit. Appreciate it. Thanks, Chris.
You bet. Thank you, Robin. All right, put her back over there. We've had a lot of questions and participation. People have hung on tight. We had about 55 people join us at one point here, Ann. So that's been a great turnout for these webinars. I've been recording it, so we're going to get this onto the YouTube channel and make that available to people to share and see. Unless we get a couple more questions, I'm going to bring up the closing slides here, let you guys know what's going on next week. And Okay. And so Leanne Berry had a question here. Have you partnered with Tree City USA or national arbor programs for tree plantings?
We attempted to partner with Tree City USA. This was in Morenci many years ago. But in order to be part of the program, you need to meet certain requirements, which I think at the time we did not. But one of our partners, the Wildlife Habitat Council, was actually just awarded a US Forest Service grant for urban and community forestry projects. And so that is something we are newly getting involved in, which I'm very excited about. So one of the case studies is going to be both in the Phoenix metropolitan area, as well as, what they're considering the rural counties in Arizona. So certainly, that is something to keep an eye on, and that might yield some interesting case studies or some interesting outputs.
Great. So I see that some people put some resources directly into the chat box in the Q&A for Michael with USDA and National Park Service. So Michael, please go into those and copy those out so that you don't lose them. I'm going to go ahead and bring up our closing slides here. So, Anne, thank you so much for your presentation today. This has been illuminating, and just really appreciate the work that Freeport-McMoRan is doing for pollinator habitat and raising awareness. This is
I appreciate that. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes. So, boy, it was early in that chat box that I put that information up there. Let me try to slip it in one more time for that evaluation link. Let me go back up to the top here. In it one more time, if you could please go to the chat box, find that evaluation survey. Really, it's about 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes if you want to write something, but very short. Just lets us know how this is going and helps me out with the program. So thank you for all your questions today. Just to close this out, bring to your attention, next week we'll be holding our next webinar on Thursday, December 10th at 11 a.m. The topic is winterizing to keep your garden alive. We have Susan Miller Hoover from the Payson Community Garden. So Susan is up in Payson around a 5,000 foot elevation. He's going to try to spread it out with some other types of things. We talked about just trying to take care of your garden, make sure you get it set up for the next year. So hope you are able to join us for that. And at this time, I'm going to shut down our program. Thank you very much. Stop recording.